All right, hello. And in this video, what we're going to do is dive a little bit deeper into temperature and its effects on insects and really talk about thermal ecology. And the reason we have been talking about and are going to continue talking about temperature so much in this course and why it has so many important effects on insects is that temperature really drives and is at the center of all biological processes on our planet. So just as a reminder of what you might not have seen since physics class, is the first law of thermodynamics, and that is that energy can't be created or destroyed. It only changes from one form to another. So in essence, we can really think of all of biology and all ecology on our planet as an example of the first law of thermodynamics. We're transforming energy. When we consume food and turn that into excrement, but use the work that we extract from that to move around, to talk, to think, what we are doing in some sense is really just transforming energy that originally comes from the sun into a different form. And in the process of that transformation, we are extracting energy and turning it into something useful. And that's really at the core of all biological systems. So we can think of all organisms on our planet, including insects, as sort of energy transformation boxes. And when we think from that perspective, it becomes really clear that temperature and the heat transfer associated with temperature is central to every biological process, from enzymes to organisms and ecosystems across our whole planet. So understanding the effects of temperature is really central to all aspects of insect biology across scales. And one way we can sort of abstract out some of the effects of temperature that is really common in the field of thermal ecology is something called the thermal performance curve. And so the reason we think of this as a curve is, in general, even though in particular cases you can estimate some effects as linear, when we look across the range of temperatures, what we almost always find is that if we look at the effect of temperature on just about any aspect of performance, in this case you're seeing a graph that uses metabolic rate as an example, but this is true for locomotion. We'll see a few examples of this in the coming slides. But temperature generally has nonlinear effects on performance. And often we'll again visualize this as a curve that has a few characteristic components. So if you look here on the effects of body temperature on metabolic rate, we can think of the sort of 0 point on that as something called a CT min, or critical thermal minimum. So this is the minimum low temperature at which this process or aspect of performance just isn't happening at all. So this can be death, it can also be total loss of muscular function, but some very low end where we no longer get any performance of what we're looking at. On the other end, we see something called the CT max, critical thermal maximum, and that is again the high end of temperature where all functioning sort of shuts down. And in between, we have some general peak of performance called the thermal optimum. So some intermediate temperature where we see the sort of best performance. And without digging too deep into the details, the reason we often see this kind of curve in these nonlinear responses, and often an asymmetric response where we see a steeper drop-off in performance at high temperatures and at low temperatures, is because different processes in general, we think, drive the effects of low temperature versus high temperature. So, for example, at low temperature, often it's the exponential increase in enzyme activity, for example, that occurs with increasing temperature is what drives the increase in performance with temperature up to a point. And the point where performance starts decreasing is often, well, you'll see on this declining curve up above me, is the denaturing of proteins and sort of dramatic loss of function. So sort of steady increase of performance or enzyme activity with temperature, but then a steep decline driving the hot end decline in performance when you're losing protein function. So generally, thermal performance curves are asymmetric, and that low and high ends are sort of governed by different mechanisms. An example of how this shows up in insect biology and performance, we can look at dragonflies, for example, and this is some work demonstrating the effect of thoracic temperature, so the temperature within the dragonfly's thorax, on just this very direct physiological proxy of performance, and that is just how much force these muscles can produce. And for dragonflies, this is really important because they are often, this particular species is a sit and wait predator, so watches and waits until fruit flies or other larger insects fly above, and then has to rapidly accelerate to catch those prey, and do that continuously almost all day. So that rapid force production and acceleration is really critical to their ecological performance and population survival. Similarly, in addition to just capturing prey, dragonflies often actually mate in flight in something called the wheel, and they need to be able to produce a lot of force to be able to sort of conduct these high maneuverability and high performance behaviors. And what we see is a strong dependence of force production on temperature. You can see here on the curves on the right. And interestingly, that actually seems to change with age. So that the curves up top there are early, freshly emerged adult dragonflies, and on the bottom is more mature dragonflies. So that can shift developmentally, but in general, we see this sort of steady curve where an intermediate temperature is optimal for performance. Similarly, if we look at things like overall locomotion, this is from a relatively recent study that looked at documented the effects of air temperature on things like running speed on the top or jumping performance on the bottom. Again, generally we see there are slightly different thermal optima between these two behaviors, but in general we see this sort of steady curve where at low and high temperatures we see declines of performance and an intermediate temperature that is optimal. And one thing that we also see is that these thermal performance curves, so these sort of dynamic responses to temperature, can actually change in many different ways. And one of those is they can change with geography. So they can depend on or be locally adapted to different local environments. So for example, if we look at that critical thermal minimum, for example, this is in bumblebees, an example that you're going to see on this bee on the left is a sort of shivering behavior from a recent study, and then you're going to see muscular spasms. And what's actually happening there at a low temperature and is that bee is reaching her critical thermal minimum, losing muscular control and actually hitting that wall. This is actually recoverable, so that those bees can recover from that, but at that minimum, the muscles of these organisms stop functioning temporarily and you lose motor control. But if you look at that, so you can measure that critical thermal minimum for different individuals within populations, and then also go compare populations. And so for example, this study looked at, on the right here, compared that critical thermal minimum across elevations and populations, and found that in populations that have the highest average temperature throughout the year, they also have the highest critical thermal minimum. And conversely, more northern and higher altitude populations have a lower critical thermal minimum, and so are better able to cope with low temperatures. And even within a species, showing that there's some degree of local adaptation potentially to different climatic conditions. So again, these thermal performance curves and the ends, the critical thermal minima and maxima, can respond to different geographic pressures in different local environments. But even within a population, there's actually some evidence that in certain cases at least, these thermal limits can change just within a season. So this is an example from ants, actually the invasive fire ants, where from the cold season through March, September, so basically through the seasons within a single year, these ants actually increase their critical thermal maxima, so they get better able to cope with high temperatures just within the course of a season, and really to a non-trivial extent, almost up to 10 degrees Celsius increase in critical thermal maxima.